So I want to give a lecture here on Heidegger, the World's Midnight, Holderlin, and Percy Shelley. And I'm just going to briefly reference Heidegger's work on Holderlin and the importance of the understanding of the world's midnight as a premonition, which is fulfilled in Heidegger's time, received to him by Holderlin, who he sees rightfully as a prophet, working on the cusp of modernity, revealing the diagnostic faculty of separation between a wholly unified, we could call it pre-modern ontos, or pre-modern ontology of being, which is intimately connected. This has to do with a severance in the sciences, a specialization, a splitting, which is also articulated by Karl Marx in terms of the political economy of machines, most notably in his Grundrisse book, but also in Capital when he talks about specialization and alienation. So this is a diagnosis which must remain at the highest level of knowledge and understanding, which is the knowledge and understanding of being, which is, you could call it the operator identity, the personality, or the essence of existence itself, the ontology of being. And what Holderlin diagnoses, and Heidegger is caught up in the maelstrom of, inevitably recanting, regrettably, his involvement in Nazi Germany at the levels of, you could call it intellectual or knowledge-based transference and dissemination of information, is the descent into a separation of consciousness, a splitting of being into a distance, which Holderlin remarks as the nature's gleaming, which is something which is wholly unified in his perception. And Holderlin, of course, descends into you could call it a form of insanity. Lives up, I believe, in a tower for an extended period of time and writes fragmented poetry until the end of his days. This is why I want to bring in Percy Shelley, because Percy Shelley himself, being an exceptional figure, a figure of exceptional knowledge power. And by knowledge power, I mean that he has a wholly unified ontological education. Highly scientifically educated Erasmus Darwin. He studies electricity, magnetism, chemistry, alchemy. This is a very classically well-versed scientist, Percy Shelley first and foremost. Not only that, but of course his philosophical education, which is steeped in the ancient Greek. He translates Plato, among others. His literary education, his historical education, and his political education, where he goes on to write several revolutionary tracts, including The Mask of Anarchy, which is taken up as a world cry for the oppressed, for the laboring body, as well as several different tracts politically in England and Ireland on atheism and on the world legislative power of poetry. So Shelley's education, not only, again, undertaken at Eton and Oxford, is very high level institutionally, but he's also a highly, highly, highly educated and self-motivated autodidact. So a figure such as Shelley only comes along once in a blue moon in the historical analogues of mankind. And because of that, there's a breach between Shelley and modernity. Shelley stands on the cusp of modernity and pronounces a unified ontology of being, a unified cosmology, which actually sits on the precipice in many ways of systems theory, even thermodynamics, all of these things which he is attuned to as they arrive on the scene shortly thereafter, including Darwin and the theory of evolution. Shelley's work, informed greatly by William Godwin's concept of political history and the history of humanity, presages a long time scale evolution, a perfectibility of man, which aligns substantially with Darwin's evolutionary theory that change over time occurs in pressurized ecosystems and environments which produce behaviors and adaptations within a species which gradually evolutionary draw out ever more compressed forms of survivability, which could equate itself maybe practically to perfectibility. But that's beside the point. The crucial fact here, or factor, is Shelley's full-scale ontology of being, his full cosmology, which is informed by the incredible depth of his cross-disciplinary, I would say transdisciplinary literacy, right? A unification of the sciences and humanities in a old, classically Greek philosophical understanding of life, which of course is what Heidegger draws from, more from Plato than from Heraclitus, which is Heidegger's kind of cast. A pursuit of the elucidation of this total understanding of being and how it comes into perfectibility in time. And of course, this allies Shelley in this path of ontological perfection of being in and through time with Hegel. This concept of teleology, or the progress of being towards a point, a singularity in the future and history into which perfectibility comes into being. This is somewhat of a different discussion, but it's important to elucidate, because what it brings us to is the loss of the ontos, which Holderlin is so sensitive to, and again why Holderlin refers so imminently and perpetually to the gods, the old gods and the death of the gods, which of course is a Nietzschean theme, which also emerges from Germany at this very same time period in which Holderlin is writing, within the very same century. Why is this? The gods themselves are ecosystemic. They are a product of a unified ontological understanding of life itself and existence itself and nature itself, which is unbroken in the classical pre-modern way of thinking about being and being itself. And this fracture emerges in modernity due to precisely the ontological loss or the fallout of a collectively conscious, at least in a Western historical sense or a Western civilizational sense, unified nature. That nature itself is being split up in the human mind into math, science, philosophy, literature, etc., so on and so forth, mechanics, systems, what have you. And that this break itself is a break in the understanding that the ontos, as Yeats would put it, the center can no longer hold. And what we see in modernity is a collapse of values, which is a product of, as Nietzsche says, the death of God. And this is Heidegger and Holderlin's world's midnight. The world's midnight is a loss even of the knowledge that God has been lost, or this unified sense of being. This unified sense of nature has fractured due to the failure of the center holding. And the center holds at last in Percy Shelley's total disavowal, as he elucidates in Queen Mab and his following works, of all of the values and hypocrisies of the British civilization and the British Empire, from marriage to religion to the academies to the pompous state of the bourgeois pseudo-intellectual project of his time. Shelley goes against every thread of British Empire on the cusp of modernity, including slavery, believes strongly in Mary Wollstonecraft's vindication of the rights of women. Mary Wollstonecraft's daughter, who's also named Mary, writes Frankenstein. And from this total disavowal, he's reaching into the bowels of the foundations of Western metaphysics, Western ontology, and Western classical consciousness, drawing from it primarily from Plato and the concept of the ideal, primarily Plato's idealism, drawing from it a essentially self-assembled cosmology. Again, he refers deeply to Greek thought, including in his masterwork Prometheus Unbound, and continues to work with the Greek strain in his final completed work, Hellas. What we need to know here is what Shelley does is a heroic act, as Ernest Becker would call it, an act of cosmic heroism, draws the entire cosmos unto himself and generates a complete ontology from and with the best knowledge of his time, which unifies every field. Science, evolutionary theory, history, political economy, philosophy. Shelley is unifying the entirety of existence through his poetic ontos, his elucidation of his poetic ontos, which is a cosmogony. Let me see if I'm actually doing that right, because I rarely use that word. Yeah, cosmogony. Right. And so this concept, right, I usually refer to this as a cosmology, but a cosmogony is about the birth. It's not just a study of the structure, but it's about the birth of being. And how that birth of being remains even in creation itself as it emerges through time. So these are the creation myths of the world. And they extend across every culture. And the issue that modernity emerges with and into is a question of what is the human being, where is the human being from, where was it born from, and thus where is it going? It's a deep and profound ontological confusion, a loss, and a churn, which formerly was seated in as diverse cultures as the Mayan and Aztec mythos and creation myths. You have Dante in the Christian and the Bible as well. This is an extensive world project of understanding what being is, where it comes from, and thus where it's going. And the loss of that primordial rudder is the fragmentation of modernity, which creates this massive sense of a loss of foundation, and therein the falling into the surface weather, which Shelley predicts in Hellas, which Heidegger and Holderlin call the world's midnight, which is a very telling phrase, because to suggest that the world's midnight is that it is to turn, I believe as Heidegger says, into a dawn. That this is a time-bound phenomenon of the loss of the mythological rudder of consciousness that allows humanity to situate itself and thus ground itself into a condition of being. Not only just being itself, but a way of being in the world, as Sartre would put it. And this is of the utmost necessity, because then all life emerges from this ruddered sense of what is being. And without that sense, the groundedness is gone, right? This is the state of groundlessness, or the Abgrund, and humanity itself is in a fallen state. And this is referred to throughout Christian theological texts, as well as obviously John Milton's Paradise Lost. This is a question that Blake deals with, and this is, of course, a question that Shelley deals with. This is the foundation, specifically of radical English literature. It's all a study of the fallen state of being, which has to do with a failed cosmogony, which must necessarily emerge from a true cosmology. Not only what is being, but what is the birth of being? Where did being come about? How is it emerging structurally? And then thus, how will it continue? This is something that has been reached for over tens of thousands of years across every civilization. World astronomy, world astrology, the attempt to create mathematical foundations, the institution of science, the institution of literature. These are all existential questions, and they have to do with what is being. And this was a project that was formerly unified in the Middle East, that was formerly unified in Greece and Egypt. It was a material, scientific, and spiritual question. And this is what unifies the history of literature and philosophy with science, math, and the study of the cosmos. Because being itself is a holistic phenomenon. It is Holderlin's gleaming, nature's gleaming, which is absolute, fundamental, first principle. But what is that gleaming? How does it gleam, and thus how does it form? And this brings us into everything from modern systems theory, Claude Shannon, Ilya Prigogine, I believe that's how you pronounce it. The questions of how do structures form, what is the underlying operation, and thus what is the underlying identity of the cosmos itself, how does it form across different geological strata, which is to say astrophysics all the way down to cellular biology, down to formation of molecular bonds. What is the logic behind creation? And this, of course, leads us to figures such as Einstein and Isaac Newton, Galileo, Kepler, and Copernicus, who are all figures, as well as Celia Payne-Gaposchkin, who are all figures who are attempting to discern in their specific disciplinary thresholds, which again, the fracture of modernity creates these disciplinary thresholds, discerning through their disciplinary thresholds the depth of behavior of certain substances, certain strata of being, whether that's astrophysics or cellular biology, how being functions in time. And by observing being's function in time, we can identify and observe the operator or operation at hand, which is the universal logic. And this brings us right back to Holderlin's Nature's Gleaming, just as much as it returns us to perhaps one of the greatest figures trapped in this churn between modernity and the classical age, which is Spinoza, who would have been an excellent Hellenic philosopher, or even a pre-Socratic philosopher, but of course is caught in the churn of maybe the best way to say it is religious dogma, and is isolated in the marginalia of his time, and then obviously becomes known as one of the great ontological philosophers who is doing this reuniting work at the absolute level of being itself. Whereas we have scientists everywhere from Prigogine to Einstein to Newton to Darwin who are revealing this operator logic, which I've discussed in my text, Law of Being and Mechanics of Persistence, revealing this operator logic at different strata. And this is why the concept of the world's midnight is so important, just as much as Shelley's vision in Hellas of this overturning that leads to perfectibility, right? The necessity of the chaos and destruction of epochs is that through fragmentation, it's very similar to the Hegelian process, the Hegelian dialectic, is that there must be a fragmentation of what is perceived to be the essence for a deeper essential perception to emerge. And this is the bridge between Heraclitus and the Law of Being, for instance. And that may sound somewhat of it, maybe an exaggeration or a tall claim, but there needs to be a real discussion here about observing the identity of the cosmos. And this brings us to Heraclitus just most foundationally in his observations on fire, the cosmos overturning, to use a bit of a self-reference in measures of fire, in with measures of fire and out with measures of fire. I'll kind of bastardize the Heraclitus fragment, because fire is Heraclitus' obsession. Seeing that all things are composed of fire, and it's almost like Heraclitus is the oracle of thermodynamics. Heraclitus presages Carnot and Clausius and Boltzmann and Clerk Maxwell. And this is just an insane period of time earlier that Heraclitus grasps this essential thermodynamic clause which powers law of being and the persistence ontos that I've elucidated. But thermodynamics itself is this bridge at the cusp of modernity, where we have some of these greatest scientific and mathematical minds, such as Boltzmann and Maxwell, who take the mantle from Carnot and draw out this entire field theory of heat sinks. It's a literal field dynamic that is occurring in real time, which is, of course, why Einstein says he stands on the shoulders of Maxwell. Maxwell actually reveals the underlying logic that's sitting on the Newtonian physical cosmos, that there's a deeper churn, a real movement of energy that is occurring there, and the energetic dynamics which Einstein then works on formalizing in a field theory sense. So what we're grasping here is this massive bridge. It's this chasm that opens up before Shelley's feet, and Shelley does this cosmic heroic act of singularly, right, in a total disavowal of essentially every ethos and every value of the British Empire, which he sees as being utterly incorrect in a classical Greek sense, which of course it is. And it has revealed itself to be, right, as it crumbles before our eyes, as false icons typically do, right? False structures built on false principles will collapse and fall apart before universal law. And this is the importance of understanding science at a profound field physical level, because then there's this understanding of what persists and what doesn't and why. And so Shelley presages this, both with Prometheus Unbound and Hellas as his two final kind of magnum opus works, which are talking about weather phases in history which require conceptual dissolution before conceptual creation. And this is a classically and typically alchemical formulation of blackening, which again, right, here we are again at Heidegger's midnight. The loss of the foothold, the loss of the ground which sustained world historical mythology, in large part due to the necessity of this profound emergence of scientific technology, which in itself is not a solve, right? It's not a salvation. It's a method of inquiry which deepens our understanding into the fabric of being itself at and by the level of the operator identity. What is being? And then thus, what unifies being across all scales? And this is a progressive enlightening. Because to know that things exist at depth and at measure, such as maybe, let's say, the anteater or a star cluster, to deepen our knowledge through the use of the telescope or advanced surgical techniques, different forms of chemical recombination to create medicines such as penicillin. These are all of the actions that are occurring simultaneous to the writings of George Trakl or T.S. Eliot or Rimbaud or Baudelaire, who themselves are indicting this corrosive force and factor of modernity itself, which is the separation and fragmentation, the death of the ontos, which itself was the life force and life source of the pre-modern society and the pre-modern consciousness itself, which perceived unification of being in nature's gleaming and thus sat within a totally unified sense of being itself, which is a radically different conception of identity at the level of being. Who am I? What am I? Where am I from? And where am I going? Which was not only allowed, but critical to the survival of pre-modern societies and pre-modern selves. And with the emergence of modernity, as Nietzsche says, with the death of God, this is lost and it's thrown into chaos. The ground is removed due to a necessary fracturing, a necessary wound within the story, the ontological story of being itself. And Shelley is at this chasm, holding himself an entirely unified ontology, which he is creating from the foundations of Western civilization, combined with his cutting-edge inquiry into science, into philosophy, which is itself his personal work. And it is the emergence of the cosmogony of liberation, of the liberated man, of the man who is no longer beholden to a cultural construct, although Shelley does allude continually and perpetually to Milton, to his heritage and roots in the British tradition, as well as the Greek. This is Shelley's deep education at work, combined with his profound ontological intelligence. Not just poetic, but ontological. And this is what's missed with Shelley. Shelley's not a poet. The poetry is Shelley writing the cosmogony of the chasm between the modern and the pre-modern, and elucidating the ontos that still holds to this day, because it is an ontos of truth which has not been broken by science. It has been elucidated, and further, it's been deepened. It's a taste that's been deepened by the awareness of science. This itself, this existential operation, which is the operator identity, as I've described in Law of Being and the persistence method or mechanism, however you want to call it, is a resurgence of the ontos. But it is a resurgence at an added level and layer of depth, of complexity, which is itself a sort of, you could say, an umami or a Caravaggio painting, if you will, which is a depth of contrast which was necessitated by technological revolution and industrial revolution. So it's this, as Heidegger says in a World's Midnight with Holderlin, this is a midnight in which there is a restructuring of consciousness. And in this restructuring, what is done is the fabric of Western humanity is fractured. It is wounded. It is made vulnerable. And of course, you can see in the unfolding decades and century therein, with World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War, Cold War, the revolutions in France, so on and so forth. There's this period of profound, from Marx and the French Revolution, this whole deep groundswell of change and of force that Shelley is feeling and is elucidated in Hellas, is that there is this force of which we now know has been a thermodynamic revolution, first and foremost, with the unleashing of fossil fuels into the atmosphere, of an entirely technologically accelerated way of being, which has sort of acted as a punctum to the formerly understood ontos. It is no longer allowed that ontos to exist, and this is what Nietzsche senses on the verge of the 20th century, is that this center will no longer hold, again, as Yeats says, the center will no longer hold, and it will no longer hold not for any reason but that the world itself, this world consciousness, is deepening, and thus this local or tribal cosmogony, this story that has been told or that we have been telling about humanity and the origins of being itself and what being is, no longer holds in the way that it's not believable anymore. It's no longer sufficient. It's no longer high definition enough. It's no longer high technology enough. It's no longer high scientifically enough. And this is the issue that we observe today, even now, with not only religion but nation, that these conceptual markers and boundaries and identity stories of self and of being, just as they emerge, slip and fall from our grasp, because they're emerging into a midnight of consciousness, which has been this churn, which is a deepening of understanding through fragmentation and separation. So everything we see emerge from this, whether it be industrial and technological capitalism, which is a mass acceleration from, let's say, feudalism, or one of these other historical forces, that this acceleration, which is an acceleration of force, just as it is an acceleration of thermodynamic burning, quite literally in the atmosphere, is revolutionizing perception. And then this revolution in perception, through the possibility created by everything from the printing press to the personal computer to artificial intelligence, is requiring the ontos to be either updated and firmed up, or for that ontos, that organizing ontos, whether at a personal, collective, global, or local level, to collapse, because it's a false identity structure or false being structure, and then for a new being structure to emerge. And this is what Shelley plants the flag in. His completely radical politics, again, anti-everything British Empire, but pro-everything humanity, nature, understanding of the primordial unity, which he is continually elucidating in his works, which is humanity's drawing towards the understanding of that source, or that primordial force, which is, you could say, Spinoza's oneness, and thus, in coalition with that ability to understand and the creation of that understanding, that is Shelley's perfectibility of man. It is a union with nature. And this is deeply Christ-like in many ways, just as it is somewhat with the Buddha, in the sense that this is an understanding of natural law, and thus an understanding of what is required to come into further union with natural law. As Christ says, the kingdom of heaven is within you. And Shelley, of course, a pronounced atheist, but perhaps Shelley is one of the most religious or spiritual forces of his time, precisely in his atheism, because he's so dedicated to understanding the ontos. The ontos is world religion, it's world spirituality. It is every force that is at work in the world, how and why, and through whom, through what. And law of being answers the operator identity. That this is a function that's replicated across all scales, and here is why and here is how. So I think this has summed it up. And what is most powerful about the emergence of modernity, as it is elucidated both through Shelley and through Holderlin, is that it is a weather system. It is a presaged period of time, which Nietzsche also catches wind of in his own way, of fragmentation and descent into night and chaos and destruction. And what I'm suggesting here is that this is a necessary descent, again, through the fragmentation of the inadequate ontos, which leads to, indelibly, the emergence of a deeper, complexified, high contrast, high total value ontos. An ontos of science, philosophy, literature, existence itself, unified. A total reunification of the disciplines, as is in Shelley's tutelage, in Shelley's learning, and in Shelley's work. So, thank you. That is it.